I am so grateful that we're nearing the end of summer, even though it's technically summer for the next couple of weeks. But today I woke up and it's about 9 in the morning right now, and it's actually cold. It's chilly, and it's the first time it's been chilly in a very long time. I'm very grateful for that because I am not a summer person. So I'm kind of ignoring the fact that it's going to be warmer later and I'm wearing like a semi long sleeve, but we're going to go with it because I don't care. So a few days ago, I asked on my community page if you would be interested in also seeing content about books. Because even though I've mostly been doing makeup content and what's in my bags and things like that, this was never intended to be a makeup channel or a what's in my bag channel. It's a channel about things that I want to talk about because this is like just purely for fun. So books are actually one of the things that I thoroughly enjoy. I've managed to read a few books throughout the summer. I went through a massive reading slump at the beginning of the year. I think I read like one book or something like that. It was just, yeah, it was not good. And then around the month of May, I went traveling and I got on a plane, and that just is usually the cure for my reading slumps. I read a lot when I travel, especially if I'm on a plane. So that made me pick up my books again and start reading. So I'm counting the books that I've read since the month of May, which technically isn't summer, but since we're already in the autumn vibe, even though it's early September, I'm going to say that mid to late May is perfectly considered summer, even though it isn't. A little disclaimer before we start, I am a little bit of a slow reader. I think I have like 5 books here, which for me is actually quite a lot. But I know I watch other people's like wrap-up videos and they're like, they've read 5 books in a week. So I'm not that person. I'm a bit of a slow reader. I'm very much a mood reader. So meaning that when I'm not in the mood, I struggle to read. I struggle to concentrate. So sometimes I just abandon my books for weeks at a time and then I pick them back up. So there's about 5 books here, which is actually pretty good for me in terms of just the last 3 months or so of reading. So I'm happy about that and just wanted to throw that out there in case you're expecting like a massive wrap up. It's not a massive wrap up at all. And another thing I wanted to mention before we jump in is that everything I say about these books is completely my opinion. This does not mean that these books are good or bad. It just means that I liked them or I didn't like them. I'll do my best to tell you why I liked them or didn't like them. This is just to say to not take it too seriously and to take it for what it is, which is a conversation about books. So that being said, I'm going to jump in with the first book I read, which I read on my Kindle. And I read a lot of books on my Kindle just because I did travel a little bit during the summer and it's very convenient. So the first book I read was Kim Jiyoung, born in 1982 by Cho Nam-yu. Hope I'm saying that correctly. And this is essentially a story of the experience of being a woman and growing up as a woman in South Korea. So our protagonist, Kim Jiyoung, is born into a family that more or less follows the traditional gender roles where women are expected to do basically everything from working to running the house and just being on top of everything, as opposed to men who are just, there's a lot less expectation for them just for the fact that they are men and they are born men. It's a very interesting read because it really lets you into that experience of being a woman in South Korea and the generational trauma that entitles, because she also goes into the story of her mother. She talks a little bit about her sister as well, other women around her, and how most of them are facing very similar circumstances and are conditioned by very similar circumstances. And even though the experience of growing up as a woman in the Western world, which is my case, is very different in some ways, there are other aspects that I think are a universal experience of being a woman and that you can absolutely relate to. I also think this was a very interesting book to read right now, since there is kind of a feminist social revolution going on in South Korea where women are kind of fed up with those gender roles, starting to stand up for themselves and just don't follow the social norm anymore. So it's a very relevant book to read now if you want to understand a little bit more where that revolution is coming from. I think that this book does a very good job at painting that picture. I gave the book 4 stars, which means that I really liked it. The difference I put in between giving a book 5 stars and giving it 4 stars is I'll give 5 stars to a book that absolutely blew me away and kind of changed something in me, maybe clicked something that I'm still thinking about right now. Whereas 4 stars is I really liked the book. I enjoyed it very much, but it didn't like make me sit there and think for weeks afterwards. So 4 stars is a book that I really, really liked. And this was definitely a 4-star read. So highly recommend it. It's also a very short read. I think it probably took me about 2 or 3 days to get through. And like I said, I'm not a very fast reader. I read about half of it on the plane ride back from the US to Spain, and then the rest of it like in the next couple of days. So very short read, definitely a very interesting book that lets you into a part of society in a country that is only now starting to really talk about the inequality that women have suffered for years. So highly recommend that you check this one out. So the next book I read was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. And I'll just start by saying that Sarah J. Maas and I have very different visions of the world. So I don't currently support her as an author very much. I buddy read this with a friend. She's already on like book 4 or 5. I don't know. But I don't think I'm going to continue the series, at least not right now. This is the story of Selena. I think that's how you pronounce it. I am pronouncing it that way because Sarah J. Maas likes to write her characters' names in very strange ways, but I'm going to call her Selena. So Selena is an assassin and she has been locked up for a while, and she's taken out of prison to take part in a tournament to become, basically to work for the king in exchange for her freedom. So if she participates in the tournament, wins, and then works for the king for a little while, she will be free. And that's basically this whole story, that we see the tournament and we learn a few things about the world. But basically, I don't like Sarah J. Maas's writing. I don't like her world building. I have read ACOTAR. I've read the whole series. Did not enjoy it, but continued reading it. She has that effect on, at least with The Court of Thorns and Roses, she had that effect on me where it's not something that I was loving, but I continued reading it. But I have a problem with her writing and her world building where there's just none of it. She just, in my opinion, she's just ripping off a bunch of other very well-known fantasy series. She kind of takes things from here and there and puts them all together and writes her own fantasy book. She puts a bunch of strange names with a lot of vowels thrown in there, and that's kind of it. I'm very sorry if you're a fan of these books, but I just did not like them. I gave this 2 stars because it's not for me. That's why I said I don't think I'm going to continue the series, because between the fact that I don't particularly enjoy her books and the fact that I don't agree with her as an author at the moment, I don't think I'm going to continue the series. So yeah, not much else to say about this book. Again, sorry if it's one of your favorites. I know that these are very like well-known and well-loved in book talk, booktube, and all those book worlds. It's just not for me. And I do enjoy fantasy. It's just that I think that this is very easy fantasy. I think it's easy in the sense that it's the easy way out. She didn't quite create something unique. She just borrowed things from other books and other stories and changed the names. That is how I feel when I read this. And after Throne of Glass, we made a very strange change into Charles Bukowski. I read Hamon Rye. I have the Spanish copy, which in Spanish it's called La Senda del Perdedor, which is basically like the way of the loser, which I actually think it's a very good translation, as opposed to just translating Hamon Rye, which honestly wouldn't make a lot of sense in Spanish. It would just sound very strange. This is the story of Henry, who is the son of immigrant parents, and he is growing up in America in the 20s and 30s, which is a very convulsed time. I think a lot of things happen, and basically he has a lot of trouble fitting in. He faces a lot of problems. He has a very unstable father, and therefore his family life is quite complicated, and that affects him in how he socializes with other people and how he, just goes about the world. And that's the whole story. We follow him until his early adult years, and spoiler, basically for him, things don't get better. So I picked it up again because I remember when I read this, I was about 20 years old and probably did not understand / hated him for several reasons. And I wanted to read it again, see how I felt now as a 34-year-old person. And I hated it. I really hope that this doesn't bring people who try to explain to me the message of the book and how it went over my head. I understand this book very well. I am perfectly capable of understanding this book, and I got the message perfectly. I just didn't like it. I didn't connect with the story at any point, not just because it's a male experience from someone in the 20s, but because I do feel like there is a force in Bukowski's writing to create things as sad as possible just for the sake of creating unlikable characters. And creating unlikable characters is an art in itself, and I just don't think that the way he does it is the way that I enjoy. What I'm trying to say is that I don't need anyone to come and explain Bukowski to me, because I've had that in the past, back when I was in university, and I didn't like this book. I remember there being a certain group of people very passionate about explaining to everyone else why they were stupid for not understanding or not liking this book. It was all reduced to the fact that we didn't understand it. And, 15 years later, I know that it wasn't because I didn't understand it. It was because I didn't like it. So I don't like the people who defend Bukowski with the argument that, oh, you just didn't understand it, or it's not for the current times. Obviously, this is not a book for the current times. This is focusing on a very specific experience that happened, 80, 90 years ago. I just didn't connect with any of the writing. I think if I pick up another Bukowski, I would read it in English. I read this one in Spanish because this is the one that I had, but maybe I would try and read it in English to see if that makes any kind of a difference. But overall, didn't enjoy it, just felt nothing while reading it, so I gave it 2 stars. The next book I read was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, and this follows the story of 2 women. This is a dual point of view story that follows Mary and Leah. Leah is a marine biologist, and she works for a research facility, and she's sent underwater in a submarine for an expedition. And Mary is her wife, who stays inland. The book is telling us the story that something strange has happened once Leah has come back, because her expedition went on for a lot longer than it should have, and things are not quite right. So Mary is observing everything that's happening with Leah and doesn't quite understand. And then when we jump to Leah's perspective, it's told from the time where she was actually in the submarine and events were unfolding. So this is a horror book, and, it's very kind of unsettling at some points. It's not scary per se, it's just kind of like weird. It's very weird. That is the best definition. I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars, and it gave me the kind of feeling that I had when I read Bunny by Mona Awad. If you've read that, you will understand what I mean when I say it's kind of unsettling and weird, but it has one of those endings, the same as Bunny did, where you're kind of expected to just kind of sit there and draw your own conclusions. It's not going to give you everything served in a little plate. You're going to have to draw your own conclusions, and depending on what point you are in your life, you might draw some conclusions or other. It's also nice and short, so you can read it in a couple of days. So I really enjoyed the book because I hadn't read anything like weird and unsettling since I read Bunny, and it was very refreshing to read something a little bit different, especially after coming from a couple of not so good reads. So I really enjoyed it and gave it 4 stars, and then went on a tangent of reading other people's opinions and conclusions about it. It was just, it was very interesting. And after I finished that, when I was still on holiday, I read Happy Place by Emily Henry, and I didn't like this. I gave it 2 stars. 2 or 3? I think I gave it 2 stars. This is entirely on me, because as I read more and more romance books, I realize that romance is not a genre that I enjoy. I just get the feeling that once you've read one of them, you've kind of read all of them. They tend to be extremely predictable and extremely easy on the writing. So you just kind of breeze through it. Any kind of plot twist that you find is very much, you can kind of see a mile away. And that's how I felt with this book as well. This is basically the story of Harriet. She's our protagonist, and she has this group of friends she's had since college. And every summer they go to one of her friends' cottage in Maine, and they spend summer there. And even after college and kind of distancing themselves and each one of them doing their own thing, they still have that in common. And to the point where their partners are now joining them in these holidays. But basically that cottage is being sold by the family. And so this is kind of their last summer there. But the premise is that she has broken up with her fiance, who's also part of that group, and she still hasn't told her friends. So that's kind of the premise of the book. And knowing that, I read it as soon as I read that kind of introduction, I kind of knew where it was going. And I think if you've read a few romance books, you kind of know too. I know that's something very comforting for people who read contemporary romance. Sometimes you read it because you know what's going to happen, and that's easy to read. It's comfortable. It's safe because you kind of know what's happening, which I completely understand. It's just not something that I enjoy. I don't like reading a book where I know kind of everything that's going to happen, and that's how I felt reading this. There's nothing against the author herself. I think that the book is written 100% in the style of a contemporary romance, and it ticks all of the boxes, but I just don't enjoy those stories. I like using them as palate cleansers when I've read other kind of books in the middle. So I just come from reading Bukowski, and then I read Our Wives Under the Sea, which is a very strange book, and I was looking for something light and fluffy to, reset my palate before I move on to something else. It just took me 3 or 4 days to read because you really breeze through it, especially when you're reading on a Kindle, which is just like, I don't know, I read a lot faster on my Kindle. I just didn't like it. I think the miscommunication trope is very abused in these kind of books. This doesn't have like a massive mix-up of miscommunication, but it is miscommunication in the sense that people aren't sitting down and talking about their feelings and opening up to their friends and loved ones about what they're feeling, and that creates a big mess. And that's kind of the story of a lot of romance books. It could just be solved if people sat down and talked, which I know if they did that, we wouldn't have the book. But sometimes these situations of miscommunication are just so blatantly obvious that I don't think they need as many chapters to develop. I did feel that with this book at some points where I felt it was just dragging. I didn't connect with any of the characters. I didn't care for them. I didn't root for them. They were all a little bit bland in my opinion, including Harriet, who is the main character. She was just a mix of everything around her. It's the Carrie Bradshaw effect, where you have Sex and the City and you have all the characters, and each of the friends falls into a very specific category. And Carrie, who is the main character, has a mix of different qualities of the different boxes her friends fit into. This is kind of the same thing. Harriet is just kind of this more bland version of her friends. I don't agree with her decisions. I don't agree with the way she does things. It's just, I didn't really enjoy it. So I know that Emily Henry is like a fan favorite in terms of modern romance books, but I'm just learning that I'm not drawn to these kind of books. I think I definitely enjoy thrillers as palate cleansers a lot more than romance. So maybe I should just stick to that. I don't know. I'm not trying to say that it's a bad book. It just definitely isn't a book for me. And lastly, I wanted to show you the book I'm currently reading, which is The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is the story of Fitz, who is the bastard son of the king. And basically he's being trained to become an assassin and serve the crown that way. Similar to Selena's story. And so far, I'm about almost halfway through. And I'm really enjoying it. I included it here because I'm probably going to be done with this before summer ends in a couple of weeks. But I'm really enjoying this as opposed to Throne of Glass because I find that not only the story is a little bit more rich in detail, but the writing is so nice. The writing in this feels a bit more elevated. That's the word I would use to describe it. The problem I have with certain fantasy books like Throne of Glass or other very popular fantasy series that we see on TikTok now is that the way they're written in the same way that you would read the Emily Henry book, for example. Very straightforward writing, not a lot of detail. Characters often talk the same way that they would talk in a modern real world setting, which I just don't think is realistic. If you're creating a completely different world, you can do whatever you want. It's your world you're creating. But I just think that there would be a different way of talking or a different way of processing information, not the same way as we do it here. And Robin Hobb is definitely doing that in this book. It's a beautifully written book. Even when we're just getting descriptions of things, they're just much more vivid. It's a very visual book. I think that's the best way to describe it. You get a very clear image of what you're reading. That is done because the writing is very, very visual. Unless things take a very strange turn, I think this is definitely going to be a 3 or 4 star. Things have to go terribly wrong for me to end up disliking this book. So we'll see. But anyway, those are the books that I read this summer. There's a little bit of everything. There's books that I liked. There's books that I didn't like as much. So like I said at the beginning, these are all my opinions about these books. It doesn't mean that the books are good or bad. It just means that I like them more or less. This is an open conversation about books, so please leave a comment and let me know your thoughts on any of these books if you've read them. And I'd also love to know what you're reading right now. I hope you liked this video. I will make more book videos as we come. Leave any ideas or suggestions in the comments, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next video.